Made possible by the Carnegie Council, the voice for ethics in international affairs.
Welcome to the Carnegie Council. Today we are delighted to have Ahmed Rashid as our speaker, and he will be discussing what is happening in Pakistan.
How much should the U.S. involve itself in crafting a new narrative for Pakistan? We now present Ahmed Rashid.
Let me just start by saying that I think Pakistan desperately needs a new narrative. A narrative that is not based on conspiracy theories and past history and arrogance and the military. Now, what I mean by that simply is that I think there have been two moments in our recent history when we could have turned the corner. The first was the end of the Cold War. A lot of countries in the third world realized that they could no longer benefit from being either the stooge of the Americans or the stooge of the Soviet Union. They had to stand up on their own feet. Pakistan was a country in which the Cold War completely bypassed it, and nobody was even aware that the Cold War was over. And we still, we as the allied ally of the Americans, still expected America to bail us out all the time. And in a sense, America did bail us out, because in 1992, there was a arms embargo on Pakistan, the end of the Cold War, and when and the Americans left Afghanistan and basically handed over Afghanistan to Pakistan, and said to the Pakistanis, "We're out of here. If you and the Saudis, you look after Afghanistan. All these Taliban types and Mujahideen and all, we don't know what to do with them. You handle them." And we did handle them, and of course we messed it up completely. We messed up Afghanistan very badly, and we encouraged the rise of the Taliban, and the rest is history. I think the second real historical moment was 9/11. The message of 9/11 was very clear, that no longer could a state promote militant Islamic extremism as a facet of its foreign policy, which was exactly what Pakistan had been doing for the last 30 years. Extremism was part of the military's foreign policy arm, legal arm, both in India and in Afghanistan. And civilian governments that came to power on the back of the military were forced to do exactly the same thing, because the military runs foreign policy, and certainly determines policy towards Afghanistan and India and the United States. But that message was utterly lost. In 2002, we nearly go to war with India. There's almost a nuclear exchange in the summer of 2002. And the Americans and the international community, rather than focusing on Afghanistan, have to run around trying to make peace between India and Pakistan. And then, of course, there are more terrorist attacks in India. We do not control the fundamentalists, even though some of the major extremist parties, such as Lashkar-e-Taiba, were banned as early as 2002. But Lashkar-e-Taiba today is out in the streets. I come from the city of Lahore. Lashkar-e-Taiba is demonstrating every single day outside the US consulate in Lahore. And we are fearful of some kind of incident. Anything can happen. Some American car can be attacked, or, anything can happen. And this is, of course, regarding the imprisonment of Ray Davis and his killing of 2 Pakistanis, with the third Pakistani being run over by an American car. This is a country that has lost several major historical moments. And it has lost it because of the myopia, particularly of the military establishment. It has framed Pakistan as a national security state, and that its principal raison d'etre for being is to confront India. That its national security objectives do not include economic development, education, health, all the other sort of trade, all the other normal things that a normal country would include. Its definition of national security includes confrontation with India. And that means whether you confront in Afghanistan, or you confront in Central Asia, or you confront in India itself. And that has been a huge hindrance to anything being allowed to develop. Now, very briefly, I think describing present-day Pakistan, there are multiple crises. there's a very severe economic crisis, which is 20% inflation, incredible joblessness, and the economy really is basically winding down. And now we've got a break with the IMF, so a whole lot of loans that were due from the World Bank and the ADB and others have been basically suspended. A huge energy crisis. In Lahore, there's no electricity for up to 16 hours a day. Okay, I can afford a generator, but 95% of the population can't. And wait till the summer comes, and the heat, and if you don't even have fans, there's no gas 12 hours a day. There's a country of 170 million people which makes nuclear weapons, which has 110 nuclear weapons, the 5th largest nuclear weapon state in the world. We cannot provide electricity for the people. So there's a huge economic crisis, there's an energy crisis, and there's now, and the fundamentalists are very much on a roll for several reasons. I mean, first, because of the blasphemy issue, which claimed the lives of 2 very prominent government officials, both which were very good friends of mine, one especially, the governor of Punjab, Salman Taseer. And the blasphemy issue, I don't know if you know about, but very simply, it is a outrageous law which allows anyone to say that so-and-so committed blasphemy. And you can't repeat what so-and-so said, because if you repeat it, it would be blasphemy. So actually so the police will come and arrest so-and-so and put him into jail, and nobody will ever know what so-and-so said. And even when you present him into court, the judge says, no, don't tell me what he said. I don't want to know what he said. And I, the accuser, will say, he committed blasphemy, and the judge will say, right, death, or whatever it is. So this is the law. And all was being demanded was that this law be amended, so that there would be some legal justification, and that, you could not be condemned to prison or death, out of nothing. Now the government has totally backtracked on that after the death of these 2 people. There was a committee set up to look at this law. That committee has been disbanded. The Prime Minister has made 3 statements in Parliament saying that Parliament will, under no conditions, amend this law or even consider amending this law or even look at this law. So please, but even after those statements, the second government figure was assassinated, the Christian Minister for Minorities. The bulk of all this is, of course, all about Afghanistan. And, as we approach the end game in Afghanistan, there's an extreme desire by Pakistan to be in the driving seat as far as any American dialogue with the Taliban would happen. Pakistan wants to be in the driving seat. The Taliban are all sitting in Pakistan. And this is opposed, obviously, by a lot of Afghans, by all the regional countries, including India, of course. And there are all sorts of conspiracy theories about what is actually happening. Many people in Pakistan believe that the Americans are going to hand over Afghanistan to India. Pakistan will be, left out. And in fact, America will do exactly what it did in '92 with Pakistan. It will be doing this time with India. And I mean, it's absurd because India cannot in any way. And anyway, I mean, the Afghans are not going to allow themselves to be controlled by a third country. They've been through that in the civil war in the '90s, and they certainly don't want it again. Now, all this, of course, is going on in the midst of what is the real national security concern of the military. And here I would say that the military is obsessed with this issue of the exit from the Western exit from Afghanistan. Now it's a long way away. The West wants to complete the exit in 2014. We're talking about 3 years yet, 4 years. And in the meantime, there will be a transition, to the Afghan authorities, an army, and all the rest of it. Now, of course, there's a big debate on whether this is going to work or not going to work. I mean, frankly, if you want my opinion, I don't think the transition can work in the midst of this very vicious civil war that we have in Afghanistan, unless this violence is brought down, unless this war comes to an end. Because transition doesn't mean just that you hand over to a revamped Afghan army. It means you've got to have a functioning government, functioning ministries, a bureaucracy, a justice system, a minimal state structure. I know it's a dirty word both in the Bush administration and in the Obama administration, but you need elements of nation building. No American will ever use that word, but that's what you need, because you can't hand over to a vacuum. You can't hand over to someone who, something which doesn't exist. I mean, that there needs to be state structures in place. Anyway, so that is that, and my whole argument is that this is not possible. This transition is not possible until you bring the war level down, the fighting level, the violence level down. And that means that you've got to talk to the Taliban. Now, the Americans are talking to the Taliban, as many of you know, as we've heard. But I think there has to be a much more public policy by the president, which has to be probably debated very hotly, but it has to be domestic reasons have to be given for this, international reasons have to be given for this. And I think if the president were to announce that the Americans are now quite happy to conduct, the fighting will not stop, but the dialogue with the Taliban will continue. There will be immediate support from Europe, from NATO. All those countries are dying for the Americans to do this right now. And secondly, of course, I think it would change the whole regional balance in my part of the world. The situation in the region right now is very, very dire. Afghanistan is a landlocked country with 7 neighbors, and we need you need some cohesion between all 7 neighbors so that they could agree on a non-interference pact inside Afghanistan, because they were the ones, all of them, who fueled the civil war in the 90s. Now, in this, we have Pakistan essentially wanting, the Pakistani military wanting to play a major role, saying we have the longest border with Afghanistan. We have the most importance, which is all very true. We are the trade conduit through Karachi, and so we have the largest ethnic group which crosses both sides, the Pashtuns. 15 million Pashtuns in Afghanistan. There's about 40 million in Pakistan. So naturally, I mean, Pakistan has a right to say, well, we have the greatest interest in Afghanistan. But at the same time, none of the other neighbors, Iran, China, the Central Asian states, and the near neighbors, which are even more powerful, India, Russia, Saudi Arabia, are going to allow another rehash like the 90s of a Pakistani-dominated Afghanistan. And that is what the whole tussle is about. I believe that if the Americans were to support publicly a dialogue, it would change the whole regional balance, because at the moment, you've got some countries acting as spoilers, some countries wanting to dominate the whole show, and everybody's at loggerheads with everybody else, basically. And there is no real international forum for bringing these countries together. I think if the Americans were to do the right thing and announce some kind of public policy, it would really put all the neighboring countries and the regional powers onto one track, because everybody would have to jump onto the American bandwagon, because then everybody would realize that there is there is a serious exit strategy now, and everybody is leaving, and either we become part of this exit and we appear helpful in this exit, and we win kudos internationally and with the Americans and with everyone else, with NATO and all the rest of it, or we act as some kind of saboteur for all this. And I think all these neighboring countries will then be forced to adopt a more conciliatory approach towards Afghanistan and a future peace in Afghanistan. Now, but unfortunately, at the moment, what we have is really the worst kind of conspiracy theories that are going around. The Pakistanis are convinced that the Americans have done the secret deal with India, which goes back to the Bush nuclear deal with India, and that now there are all sorts of geostrategic deals, that India will be used as the gendarme for the US in containing Pakistan, containing China. So using the fundamentalists as a kind of counterweight to this India thing becomes even more important. And even though many of these fundamentalist groups, like the Pakistani Taliban, like Lashkar-e-Taiba, have in a sense now become international groups. They are now training, at least, and funding and arming attempts to carry out bomb blasts in America and Europe and other places. Now, and the real fear is that if you allow this to continue, you're setting up several groups whose justification for terrorism is not necessarily going to be global jihad. It's going to be anti-Indian or in defense of this Indo-Jewish American conspiracy, or in some slightly different language. But nevertheless, the outcome of this will be you'll have Pakistani groups, as has been the case already, training foreigners to carry out attacks, around the world. And that is obviously going to be a devastating. I mean, so far we've been very lucky. Nothing very much. I mean, there have been bomb blasts. You've had a bomb blast in Times Square. But I mean, nothing very much has worked. But God forbid, if something works and people die because of this in large numbers, and we've had attacks in Europe, in Britain especially, and in Scandinavia and in Germany, and a lot of these attacks are traced back to groups, in Pakistan. So we need a government and an army and a civil society that is actually in control of its own country. We need that to be strengthened. We need the economy to be strengthened. And we need in my opinion, an end game in Afghanistan to start now, so that we can, so that you can convince the Pakistanis that actually there are no conspiracy theories here. We're not handing it all over to India, and you are very important in this. And either now you play the game and you help us, and you get benefits from that also, and you do get some, influence in Afghanistan, and you're a very important part of the whole equation. Or you still allow all these groups to operate and train, young guys from America and from Europe and, all the rest of it, and continue this game, which really is endless and which will eventually, put you in the dock. So I think we are faced with this huge dilemma. And at the moment, unfortunately, we are in a state of, I wouldn't say war, but I would say virtual war with the United States, quite simply, over, it's an intelligence war that is going on, and it's extremely dangerous. Because, of course, the tendency, even if the intelligence agencies do not, the tendency will be for these fundamentalists to say, finally, the ISI is, slamming it to the CIA, so this is a moment we should, have another bomb blast in Delhi, or have another bomb blast in Kabul. And of course, what would that lead to? It could be catastrophic for the region. The Afghans have been very patient too, because a lot of the bombings of the Indian embassy, 3 bombings of the Indian embassy in Kabul have also been carried out from people who've been tracked back to Pakistan. So, an escalation in the region is very possible at any time. And I think it's very important that the US has a more coherent policy on Afghanistan than what we've seen so far. Thank you very much indeed.
That's a pretty grim picture you just painted, and I think I'm going to ask you a question which may make it even grimmer, and that's about nuclear weapons. What about the security of those weapons? What can you say about that? How secure or insecure are they?
I mean, we have an army that is in control of the nuclear weapons. This army is very much solid, it's hierarchical, it's disciplined. There are no cracks in the army at the moment. And the nuclear weapons are all distributed, parts of, bits and pieces of it are distributed, all over the country. It's not that they're all sitting in one place. So there's no danger of anyone getting hold of a nuclear weapon. Somebody could get hold of some parts of a nuclear weapon or some fuel or something like that, but nobody can get hold of a nuclear weapon. Clearly the Bush administration after 9/11 did spend $100 million providing fail-safe mechanisms and all the rest of it. But, I mean, there are huge questions. I mean, with this whole threat of fundamentalism, with the fact that, the governor of Punjab was killed by a member of his own bodyguard and a member of the special forces, and that was kind of, welcomed by the police and by other people. I mean, how much of that kind of sympathy is latent in the nuclear establishment, amongst the scientists and guards and all the rest of it? I mean, we don't know. So, but I have heard that after the killing of Salman Taseer, there was a revamped screening of, all personnel, etc. But I think when you have such a huge industry, which perhaps employs, anything between 70 to 100,000 people, it's probably going to be very difficult to, screen everyone totally effectively. A lot of liberals have been saying, what the hell are we spending 30% of the budget on nuclear weapons for? When we're all starving, we have no electricity, and we have no gas, and where's our priorities? And the military yesterday issued a very tough, threatening statement, saying anybody who makes that statement is a traitor and will be considered as a traitor by the military. In other words, if you make a statement saying you're spending too much on the military and nuclear weapons, you'd be considered a traitor. I mean, alternate views are not being taken on board.
You refer to the fundamentalists in Pakistan. I'm wondering, to what extent are these fundamentalists a united bloc? When you talk about this confrontation between the army will not shoot on the fundamentalists, are the fundamentalists not themselves maybe segmented into different groups, and how extreme are they? And are all the fundamentalists, for example, fundamentally, not to make a pun, backing the Taliban, or are there differences of opinion there? So to what extent could a democratic or a more democratic-leaning government actually try to exploit differences, and what is the opposing camp?
I think you're absolutely right. I think if we had a strong leadership, civilian leadership, that could be exploited very easily, because, of course, the fundamentalists are deeply, deeply divided. And, I mean, the joke is that no two mullahs can ever sit together at a table, because they'll start, attacking each other immediately. And here we're talking about 24, I mean, at the moment there are about 24 religious parties and militant groups who are united in this movement. Now, there is a common agenda right now, which is very easy to unite on. Blasphemy, common, very easy to unite on. Americans, anti-Americanism, very easy to unite on. And the economy, joblessness, etc., very easy to unite on. Of course, I mean, once you get past this, to talk about, can there be an electoral alliance? What are their views on elections? Some of them don't believe in elections. Some of them do believe in elections. I mean, you could certainly envisage a breaking up of this alliance. I mean, just take the blasphemy issue is dead now. Nobody's raising it. The Prime Minister has given 3 statements in Parliament saying it's over, forget it, no amendments, no changes to the law. But even then, they're still killing. They killed this minister. And it's likely they will kill other people. Now, they know perfectly well that the blasphemy law is not about to change. But they also know that this is the best uniting factor we've ever had in our history. And this is the way to go. We've got to keep this one alive, even though the government is completely backtracked. And we can fool the people half the time if we can't fool them all the time. And so, unfortunately, I think it's very easy to exploit the differences amongst them, and to bring some of them on board and to turn some against the other, etc. But we don't have a political leadership that is strong enough to do this.
Is there anything going to be done about the demographic situation? Because even the wealthiest country in the world could not possibly sustain the rate of growth. And my real question is, what can the United States and the international community, Europeans and the US, is there any way in which these problems can be constructively, this is a long-term investment issue, can these problems be constructively dealt with? Thank you.
I think that's one of the major crises that we face. We have a growth rate of around 2%. We have a population growth rate of around 2.3%, I think, something like that. So, where, you do the math, it's very simple. And we have not had a population control program, I think, until the Benazir's program in the early 90s. Musharraf could have done so much. He had so much money. He had so much international support. There was not this degree of crisis. The economy was doing relatively well. He could have done much more on this, but the issue was never raised. And there's been this abject fear of the religious right because they would raise objections and, all the rest of it. But I think they're very, as you say, they're very sound economic arguments for this. If education, population control, health, social services are not considered part of national security, they are not considered part of the absolute demands of the state apparatus and how they define national security, then I'm afraid. Whereas nuclear weapons, confrontation with India, buying more conventional weapons, etc., are considered, the most important thing, we are going to suffer. After these devastating flood controls, I mean, there's almost no flood control program. Bangladesh has done it, you know. Bangladesh has done more flood control, and, you know, because they're very low-lying, etc., etc. I mean, they've done more flood control than we have. You know, they have a higher literacy rate. And Bangladesh, by the way, if you remember, was part of Pakistan, you know, in 1970. Bangladesh has a higher literacy rate than we have. They have a higher employment rate than we have. And Bangladesh was, according to the, you know, the Kissinger's famous comment, a basket case. You know, it's not a basket case anymore, let me tell you. It's one of the states of South Asia which is doing pretty well. And it's you know, taking advantage of the whole boom in India and all the rest of it. So I think, you know, these issues are absolutely critical. And the biggest issue we are going to face even more than is water. We have a chronic water deficit problem. And huge tracts of Pakistan are going to run out of water. Because for years we've been, you know, the water table has gone down. We've been taking all this water out. And, you know, and the glaciers are all melting, you know, at the wrong time. And this whole cycle of monsoons and glacier melt and all that is, you know, changing very rapidly, and we have no recourse. And we'll be 250 million people. We'll be as large as the United States in population terms, I think, in 20 years.
Well, thank you very much. We hope next time you come back, you'll bring some good news.
We hope this program was informative and provided some perspective on the underlying ethical issues.
Made possible by the Carnegie Council, the voice for ethics in international affairs. For more information, see www.carnegiecouncil.org.